A 17-year-old boy stands at Boston Harbor with nothing. No money beyond a few coins, no connections worth mentioning, no formal education past age 10. He's running away from an apprenticeship, which makes him a fugitive. Within 50 years, this runaway will become the most famous American in the world. But right now, in 1723, he's just another poor kid boarding a boat to nowhere. Benjamin Franklin should have disappeared into history. Instead, he became the face on your $100 bill. How does that happen? The answer isn't what you think. Colonial Boston in 1706 wasn't Boston. Not yet. It was a provincial outpost clinging to a peninsula, maybe 7,000 people total, most descended from Puritan refugees who'd fled England 2 generations back. The place was woodhouses and unpaved streets that turned to freezing ruts in winter and rivers of muck in spring. Pigs wandered freely, serving as the city's sanitation system. Housewives tossed kitchen waste directly into the road. The animals disposed of it within minutes. The harbour defined everything. Dozens of vessels crowded the wharves on any given day. Coastal traders, ships from the Caribbean hauling molasses and sugar. Occasional vessels from England bringing manufactured goods and news. The waterfront swarmed with sailors and merchants, and the tradesmen who kept the maritime economy functioning. Coopers making barrels, sailmakers stitching canvas, and men like Josiah Franklin, providing the candles that would light ships' cabins and Boston's homes. If you enjoy stories like this, like and subscribe, so you don't miss the next one. And feel free to comment what time it is and where you're listening from. Josiah Franklin had arrived in Boston from England in 1683, fleeing religious persecution. He came from Ecton in Northamptonshire, where Franklins had worked the same land for generations. But Josiah was a youngest son, no inheritance. He learned the dyer's trade, colouring cloth in whatever shades fashion demanded. More importantly, he became a dissenter, rejecting the Church of England's authority. Under English law, that made him a criminal. When persecution intensified, Josiah sold everything, gathered his wife and 3 children, and boarded a ship for Massachusetts. The Atlantic crossing took 2 months in a wooden vessel that creaked and groaned through every storm. Many passengers died during such voyages. The Franklin family survived. They arrived with almost nothing. Josiah discovered his trade wasn't needed here. Few colonists could afford professionally dyed cloth, so he reinvented himself as a tallow chandler and soap maker. Humble work, but necessary. Every household needed candles, and the cheapest came from animal fat. The work was brutal. Purchase fat from butchers, render it in great kettles, pour it into moulds around cotton or flax wicks. The smell was terrible, the profit margins thin. But Josiah was industrious. He built a modest business, acquired a house on Milk Street, established himself as respectable. His first wife died in 1689, probably from childbirth complications or disease. 7 children left motherless. Josiah needed a wife desperately. A widower with small children couldn't manage alone. He remarried within months to Abiah Folger. This marriage proved remarkably fruitful. Abiah would give him 10 more children, 17 total, though not all survived infancy. Abiah came from Nantucket. Her father, Peter Folger, was a remarkable man. Miller, teacher, surveyor, occasional poet, who'd learned the Wampanoag language and served as interpreter between English settlers and Native Americans. A freethinker who wrote poems criticizing religious intolerance. That independent spirit passed to his daughter. Abiah was literate, unusual for women of her class and time. Most couldn't read beyond simple Bible verses, but Abiah read fluently and valued education. She would pass this love of learning to her children. The Franklin household on Milk Street was crowded and perpetually short of resources. The tallow chandlery occupied the ground floor, filling the house with the acrid smell of boiling animal fat. The family lived in rooms above and behind the shop. Privacy was impossible. Children shared beds, sometimes 3 or 4 to a mattress. In winter, they huddled together for warmth since heating fuel was expensive. In summer, the crowded quarters were stifling. Meals were simple. Bread and butter formed the staple. Cornmeal mush. Salted fish. Occasionally meat, though fresh meat was luxury. Vegetables from the small garden in season. The family gathered around a large table, Josiah at the head, a buyer managing younger children, older ones helping serve. But despite cramped quarters and modest circumstances, the Franklin household was rich in something more valuable: intellectual stimulation. Josiah was thoughtful, more intellectual than his humble trade suggested. He loved conversation and often invited educated friends to dine, ministers debating theology, merchants discussing news from London, craftsmen sharing observations about their trades. The conversation ranged across topics children in most tradesmen's households never heard: politics, philosophy, natural phenomena, moral questions. Young Benjamin sat at the table, eating simple meals, listening with intense concentration as adults talked. He learned that ideas could engage like any game, that the life of the mind was open to anyone willing to think seriously, that education wasn't confined to schools, but could happen anywhere people gathered to discuss important questions. Josiah encouraged reading in a household where books were precious. A single book might cost a week's wages. Paper was expensive. Leather bindings, metal clasps, the labour of printing or copying by hand made books luxury items only the wealthy casually acquired. But Josiah valued education enough to sacrifice for it. He accumulated a small library. The Bible, of course, read daily and treated with reverence. Sermons by Puritan divines like Cotton Mather. Devotional works. But Josiah also owned Plutarch's Lives, biographies of great Greeks and Romans that would profoundly influence Benjamin's moral development. These weren't Christian stories, but pagan histories, tales of men who achieved greatness through virtue, courage, and wisdom before Christ was born. Puritans accepted such works because they demonstrated moral truth existed across all times and cultures. From Plutarch, young Benjamin learned that character was built through action, that greatness could be achieved through virtue and discipline, that the lives of ancients offered lessons for moderns. He read about Lycurgus, who gave Sparta its laws, about Solon, who reformed Athens, about Alexander, who conquered the known world, about Cicero, whose eloquence saved the Roman Republic, about Cato, who chose death over dishonor. These stories shaped his imagination and aspirations. He would return to these biographies throughout his life, measuring himself against antiquity's heroes. Abiah Franklin was warm and capable, managing her enormous household with efficiency and good humor that astonished witnesses. 17 children, though not all living at home simultaneously, was overwhelming responsibility. The cooking, cleaning, mending, nursing, teaching, disciplining, the endless cycle of pregnancy and childbirth, each carrying death's risk. Yet Abiah managed while also helping with the business, serving customers, keeping household accounts. She was strong with cheerful disposition and sharp intelligence her son clearly inherited. In his autobiography, Franklin would write that he couldn't remember a time when he couldn't read, suggesting his mother taught him letters before he could form memories of learning. On January 17, 1706, Abiah gave birth to her 8th child, and Josiah's 15th. They named him Benjamin, a biblical name meaning son of the right hand. He was baptized the same day at Old South Church. The haste reflected Puritan concerns about infant mortality. Perhaps 1 child in 4 died before reaching adulthood. Parents wanted souls saved should death come quickly. But Benjamin Franklin wouldn't die young. He'd live 84 years, long enough to see the world transformed and to help transform it himself. Young Benjamin grew up surrounded by his father's trade, the cutting and rendering of fat, the pouring of candles in moulds, the wrapping and selling of soap. Unglamorous work, but it taught lessons about chemistry, about properties of different materials, about precision and patience. Josiah was thoughtful, more intellectual than his trade suggested. He loved conversation. Young Benjamin listened, absorbing everything, learning that ideas could engage as powerfully as any game. His father encouraged reading. Books were expensive, but Josiah managed to accumulate a small library. Benjamin devoured them. Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, read until nearly memorized. Plutarch's Lives, again and again. Daniel Defoe's essay on projects, which argued for practical improvements to society through mutual benefit organizations. The idea would stay with him. Abia was warm and capable. She was literate, unusual for women of her class. In his autobiography, Franklin would write he couldn't remember when he couldn't read. The Franklin household wasn't wealthy, but it was rich in intellectual stimulation. In many colonial homes, education extended only to basic literacy. But in the Franklin home, ideas mattered. Questions were encouraged. Curiosity was cultivated. And Benjamin had curiosity in abundance. From earliest years, he asked endless questions. Why does wood float? Why does iron sink? What makes tides rise and fall? How do ships sail against wind? His father answered when he could or directed the boy to books that might explain. Boston Harbor became young Benjamin's playground and laboratory. He learned to swim early, becoming one of the strongest swimmers among local boys. He invented crude flippers for hands and feet to increase speed. He taught himself to float on his back for hours, studying water's behavior. The sea was everywhere. The city's economy depended on it. Ships brought goods from England and the Caribbean. They carried Massachusetts timber, fish, and rum to distant markets. The harbor crowded with vessels. Wharves bustled with sailors, merchants, laborers, loading and unloading cargo. Benjamin watched with fascination, but his father had other plans for his youngest son, plans that would shape the next crucial years of his life. Josiah Franklin had 17 children to provide for, with limited resources. Most sons were apprenticed to trades. Daughters would marry, becoming their husbands' responsibilities. But for Benjamin, his 15th child and 10th son, Josiah harbored special ambition. He would tithe his son to the church. The practice rooted in Old Testament concept of the tithe, giving 1/10 of one's increase to God. Josiah had 10 sons by Abiah. He'd dedicate the 10th to religious service. Benjamin would become a minister. In Puritan Boston, the ministry was the most respected profession, the only learned calling available to colonial youth. Ministers required extensive education, years of formal schooling followed by study at Harvard College. It was enormous investment for a tradesman's family. But Josiah was determined. At age 8, Benjamin was enrolled in Boston Latin School, the most prestigious educational institution in the colony. Founded in 1635, it prepared boys for Harvard by drilling them in Latin, Greek, and classical literature. For a few bright months, Benjamin excelled. He loved learning, devoured lessons, rose to the head of his class with remarkable speed. Teachers praised his quickness and predicted brilliant future. But Josiah was doing calculations. The cost of keeping Benjamin in school meant lost labor and incidental expenses the family could ill afford. And beyond Boston Latin loomed Harvard's far greater expense: tuition, room, board, books. Years of study during which Benjamin would contribute nothing to family support. After less than a year, Josiah withdrew his son. The family simply couldn't afford it. He tried a cheaper alternative, enrolling 10-year-old Benjamin in a school run by George Brownell that focused on practical subjects, writing and arithmetic, rather than Latin and theology. Benjamin did well in writing, but struggled with arithmetic. Even this modest schooling was brief. At age 10, Benjamin's formal education ended forever. He would never attend another school. never darken a college door, never earn a degree. Josiah brought his son into the family business. At 10 years old, Benjamin Franklin began working full-time in his father's tallow chandlery. The work was tedious and unpleasant. Cutting wicks, filling molds, tending fires under great kettles of bubbling fat, running errands, serving customers. The smell of rendering animal fat permeated everything. It clung to clothes and hair, impossible to wash away completely. Benjamin hated it. He later wrote that he developed a strong inclination for the sea, dreaming of escape to a sailor's life of adventure and freedom. But Josiah, who'd already lost one son to the ocean, refused to permit it. He was determined to find a trade that would satisfy his restless son's intelligence while keeping him safely on land. For the next year, Josiah took Benjamin on walks through Boston, visiting workshops and observing various craftsmen at their trades. They watched joiners shaping wood, bricklayers building walls, turners working their lathes, braziers casting brass. Josiah hoped something would capture his son's interest. These excursions gave Benjamin invaluable education in practical mechanics. He observed how things were made, how they functioned, how skilled hands could shape raw materials into useful objects. The knowledge would serve him well when he turned to invention later. Nothing captured his imagination the way books did. While his father searched for the right trade, Benjamin taught himself. He spent every spare penny on books, borrowed volumes from anyone who'd lend them, read by candlelight after work was done. He discovered Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress and read it until he nearly memorized it. He found Plutarch's Lives and immersed himself in the noble deeds of Greeks and Romans. He stumbled across Daniel Defoe's essay on projects, which argued for practical improvements to society through mutual benefit organizations. The idea stayed with him. At 12 years old, Benjamin Franklin was an apprentice candlemaker who dreamed in books. And then his older brother James returned to Boston with a plan that would change everything. James Franklin was 9 years older than Benjamin, old enough to have finished his apprenticeship and established himself as a printer in London. In 1717, he returned to Boston and set up a printing shop, the fourth in the city. Printing was one of the most important trades in the colonial world. Printers produced everything from legal documents and government proclamations to books, pamphlets, and newspapers. A good printer needed literacy, mechanical skill, business acumen, often served as writer and editor as well. Josiah saw his opportunity. He convinced James to take Benjamin as apprentice. In 1718, 12-year-old Benjamin Franklin signed indentures that would bind him to his brother until he reached 21. 9 years of service in exchange for training in the printing trade, room and board, and one complete set of clothes at the end of his term. Benjamin took to printing with passion that candlemaking had never inspired. The print shop was a world of ideas made tangible. Every day brought new texts to be set in type, new arguments to be composed, new knowledge to absorb. The work was physically demanding. Composing text required hours of standing, selecting individual letters from the type case and arranging them backward in the composing stick. The press itself required strength to operate, pulling the lever that brought paper down onto inked type. There was endless cleanup, washing the forms, distributing type back into cases. But Benjamin loved it. For the first time in his life, his work engaged both hands and mind. He also had access to books, far more than he could ever have afforded to buy. Customers would sometimes lend books to apprentices. James would bring home volumes to print. Benjamin would stay up through the night reading by candlelight, then return books early next morning before they were missed. He developed a method of systematic self-education that would serve him throughout life. When he read something that impressed him, he'd try to recreate it from memory, then compare his version with the original to identify weaknesses. He taught himself to write persuasive prose by studying elegant essays in The Spectator, Joseph Addison, and Richard Steele's influential London periodical. He'd read an essay, wait several days, then try to rewrite it from memory. When he compared his version to the original, he could see where his vocabulary was limited, where arguments lacked force, where style was clumsy. Then he'd practice those specific skills. He converted essays into poetry to expand vocabulary, then back into prose. He scrambled arguments and practiced rearranging them to improve logical thinking. It was a training regimen as rigorous as any athlete's, applied to the craft of writing. The relationship between the two brothers was complicated. James was the master, Benjamin the apprentice. James could command and punish. Benjamin owed obedience. But Benjamin was brighter than his brother, quicker to learn, more creative. Both of them knew it. The inequality of talent strained against the inequality of authority. In 1721, when Benjamin was 15, James made a bold decision. He'd start a newspaper, only the fourth in the American colonies. He called it the New England Courant. Unlike existing Boston newspapers, which simply reprinted news from London and official proclamations, the Courant featured original essays and satirical commentary. James published pieces critical of Puritan clergy's promotion of smallpox inoculation, mocking their support for a medical procedure that many Bostonians considered dangerous. The establishment was outraged. Religious and political authorities viewed the Courant as threat to public order. How dare a mere tradesman presume to criticize his betters? But the controversy sold papers. The Courant became the talk of Boston. Young Benjamin watched, learning that in print a commoner's words could carry as much weight as a gentleman's. That ideas mattered more than social rank. He longed to contribute to the paper, but James dismissed his efforts. A teenage apprentice had nothing worth publishing. So Benjamin devised a scheme. Late at night, after the print shop closed, he wrote letters in disguised hand and slipped them under the shop door. The letters were signed Silence Dogood, supposedly written by a middle-aged widow, witty and opinionated, who offered thoughts on everything from fashion to education to treatment of women. The Silence Dogood letters were brilliant satire. They mocked pretensions of Boston's elite while championing common sense and practical virtue. They were written in conversational style that made them accessible and entertaining. Readers loved them. They became the most popular feature in the Courant. James published 14 Silence Dogood letters without knowing who wrote them. His friends would gather in the print shop to speculate about the author's identity. Some guessed it was a well-known minister. Others suspected a sophisticated lady of Boston society. No one imagined it was the teenage apprentice setting type in the corner. When Benjamin finally revealed himself as Silence Dogood, James was furious. His younger brother had made a fool of him. The power dynamic in the shop shifted perceptibly. Other apprentices and even customers began to see Benjamin differently. He wasn't just a clever boy, but a genuine writer. James responded with increasing harshness. He exercised his authority as master over apprentice, using physical punishment to reassert control. The beatings grew more frequent and more severe. Meanwhile, the Courant's attacks on authority caught up with its publisher. In 1722, James wrote something that offended the colonial government so deeply that he was jailed for a month and then forbidden to publish the newspaper. The solution was to transfer the paper to Benjamin's name. At 16 years old, Benjamin Franklin became nominal publisher of the New England Courant, though everyone understood that James remained the true editor. To make the legal fiction work, James publicly cancelled Benjamin's apprenticeship indentures. But privately, he forced Benjamin to sign new secret indentures, binding him to continue serving until age 21. This gave Benjamin leverage. He was now legally free, even though James still tried to treat him as apprentice. The contradiction couldn't hold. The relationship between the brothers deteriorated completely. In September 1723, after one beating too many, 17-year-old Benjamin Franklin made a decision that would change his life. He would run away. In colonial America, breaking an apprenticeship was serious offense. James made sure that no printer in Boston would hire his runaway brother, but Benjamin was determined. He sold some of his books to raise money for passage. In October 1723, he boarded a boat bound for New York. He left Boston with almost nothing, a few coins, the clothes on his back, and a mind full of knowledge that no one could take away. The boat journey to New York took 3 days through rough seas. Benjamin arrived in the city, hungry, disheveled, and alone. He was 17 years old, a fugitive from legal obligations with no connections and little money. He went immediately to the shop of William Bradford, New York's only printer, hoping for work. Bradford had no positions available, but he mentioned that his son Andrew, who ran a printing shop in Philadelphia, might need help. With nothing to lose, Benjamin decided to continue south. The journey to Philadelphia became an ordeal. He took a boat across New York Bay to Perth Amboy, but the vessel was caught in a squall and nearly capsized. Benjamin spent 30 hours soaked to the skin, bailing water before they finally reached shore. He walked 50 miles from Perth Amboy to Burlington in the rain, arriving feverish and exhausted. At Burlington, he caught a boat down the Delaware River to Philadelphia. The journey took all night. When Benjamin finally arrived on Sunday morning, October 6, 1723, he was dirty, disheveled, and utterly spent. He had $3 in his pocket. He walked into a bakery and asked for 3 pennies worth of bread. The baker, unfamiliar with Boston currency, gave him 3 enormous puffy rolls. Benjamin tucked one under each arm and walked down Market Street, eating the third. So hungry he barely noticed how ridiculous he must have looked. A young woman standing in a doorway watched him pass and laughed at the sight. Her name was Deborah Reed. 7 years later she'd become his wife. But on that Sunday morning, Benjamin Franklin was just a bedraggled stranger stumbling through Philadelphia with bread under his arms. He followed other people to a Quaker meeting house, sat down, and promptly fell asleep during the silent worship. When he woke, he wandered to the waterfront and found a clean-looking house where he was given a bed. He slept for hours. The next morning, Monday, October 7th, 1723, Benjamin Franklin began to build the life that would make him famous. He found Andrew Bradford's print shop and asked for work. Bradford had no openings, but sent Benjamin to Samuel Keimer, another Philadelphia printer who needed help. Keimer was an odd character, a former London printer who wore his beard long and kept the Jewish Sabbath. He hired Benjamin on the spot. Philadelphia was different from Boston. It was newer, more diverse, less bound by rigid religious orthodoxy. Founded by Quakers under William Penn's charter, the city welcomed people of all faiths. English Quakers mixed with German Lutherans, Scottish Presbyterians, Irish Catholics, and Jews. The Quaker emphasis on tolerance and practical commerce created an atmosphere of openness that contrasted sharply with Puritan Boston's stern conformity. The city itself was growing rapidly. Laid out in a grid pattern, it was more orderly than Boston's medieval tangle of streets. The Delaware River provided access to the Atlantic, making Philadelphia a major port. By 1723, the population was approaching 10,000, and the city was on its way to becoming the largest in the American colonies. Benjamin thrived in this environment. At Keimer's shop, he demonstrated skills that surpassed his employers. He was faster at composition, more precise in his work, more knowledgeable about the technical aspects of printing. Within weeks, the employer-employee relationship had inverted. Keimer relied on Benjamin to manage the shop. Benjamin found lodging with the Reed family, the same household where the young woman who'd laughed at him on his first morning lived. Deborah Reed was about 16, cheerful and pretty. Benjamin began courting her almost immediately, with her parents' blessing. He made friends easily in Philadelphia. His wit, his learning, and his conversational skills drew people to him. He joined a philosophical society where young men gathered to debate and discuss ideas. He became known as an entertaining companion and a brilliant talker. But then Governor William Keith intervened with an offer that seemed too good to be true. Governor Keith was impressed by the articulate young printer he met through social connections. When Keith learned that Benjamin wanted to establish his own printing business but lacked capital to buy equipment, the governor made a remarkable proposal. He would personally back Benjamin in setting up a print shop. All Benjamin needed to do was travel to London, select the best printing equipment, and purchase it using letters of credit that Keith would provide. The governor would pay all expenses and become a silent partner in the new business. It was an extraordinary opportunity, the kind that could establish a young man for life. Benjamin's father, whom he'd visited briefly in Boston to attempt reconciliation, advised caution. Josiah Franklin told his son that the governor's promises seemed too generous, too unlikely to materialize. But Benjamin, 18 years old and ambitious, wanted to believe. He returned to Philadelphia, accepted Keith's offer, and in November 1724 boarded a ship for London. He carried letters of introduction that Governor Keith had promised to provide, or so he believed. The voyage across the Atlantic took weeks. As the ship approached the English coast, Benjamin asked the captain about the governor's letters. The captain said they were in a bag with other mail and would be sorted when they reached London. When the ship docked and the mail was finally sorted, Benjamin discovered the truth. There were no letters of credit from Governor Keith, no letters of introduction, no financial backing. Nothing. Governor Keith had lied. The entire scheme was a fantasy, perhaps something the governor genuinely intended, but had no means to execute. Keith was known for making grand promises he couldn't keep, for encouraging young men with airy assurances that came to nothing. Benjamin Franklin was stranded in London, 18 years old, thousands of miles from home, with no money, no equipment, and no prospects. It was December 1724, and he was completely alone in one of the largest cities in the world. London in 1724 was overwhelming. With a population approaching 600,000, it was by far the largest city Benjamin had ever seen. Boston had 7,000 people. Philadelphia had 10,000. London had more people in a single parish than in all of colonial Philadelphia. The city was a maze of narrow streets, packed with humanity from every nation and station. Wealthy merchants in fine clothes brushed past beggars in rags. Street vendors hawked their wares with ear-splitting cries. Hot pies, fresh oysters, knives to grind. The cacophony was constant, overwhelming, a symphony of commerce and survival. Hackney coaches clattered over cobblestones worn smooth by centuries of traffic. Sedan chairs carried wealthy ladies through streets too narrow for carriages. Porters bent double under enormous loads balanced on their backs. Apprentices ran errands, dodging between pedestrians. Pickpockets worked the crowds with practiced skill. The air was thick with coal smoke from thousands of household fires and workshops. London's famous fog was not natural mist, but a choking combination of moisture and smoke that turned buildings black, stung the eyes, and made breathing difficult on the worst days. The smell of human waste pervaded everything, as the city's primitive sewage system simply dumped refuse into the Thames, or collected it in cesspits that periodically overflowed. The river itself was both highway and sewer. Ships from around the world crowded its waters, bringing goods from India, the Caribbean, the American colonies, the Mediterranean. The docks stretched for miles, a forest of masts and rigging. But the same river received all of London's waste, making it a foul, dangerous waterway, despite its commercial importance. For a young man from the colonies, it should have been terrifying. But Benjamin Franklin possessed a quality that would serve him throughout his life: an unshakable confidence in his own abilities. If Governor Keith wouldn't support him, he'd support himself. He found work immediately at Samuel Palmer's printing house in Bartholomew Close, one of the finest print shops in London. Palmer's establishment was far larger and more sophisticated than anything Franklin had seen in America. The shop employed dozens of men, operated multiple presses, and produced work of extraordinary quality for the most demanding customers. The master craftsmen there were initially skeptical of the young American. Colonials were considered provincial, behind the times, crude in their skills. But Benjamin quickly demonstrated abilities that matched or exceeded those of the London journeyman. He could compose type faster than most of them, his fingers flying through the typecase with practiced precision. His knowledge of the printing process was comprehensive. He understood not just the mechanical operations, but the craft's finer points. Which papers took ink best? How to mix ink for different purposes? How to adjust pressure for different types of work? His finished pages were clean, precisely aligned, and free of the errors that plagued less careful workers. The London pressmen had a custom that Franklin found wasteful and foolish. They drank beer throughout the workday, believing it gave them strength for the heavy labour of operating the press. Some men would consume 6 pints during a single shift, spending much of their wages in the alehouse and arriving at work half drunk. Benjamin drank only water, earning himself the nickname the Water American. He argued that beer actually weakened the body and dulled the mind, that bread provided better energy for sustained work, that sobriety allowed for better craftsmanship. His fellow workers mocked him at first, but his superior work output gradually convinced some of them. The man who drank water could lift as much, work as long, and produce better quality than those who believed alcohol was necessary for strength. From Palmer's, he moved to an even larger establishment, Watts's printing house near Lincoln's Inn Fields. This was one of the great printing houses of London, employing 50 men and producing books for the most prestigious publishers. The shop occupied a multi-story building with different operations on different floors. Ground floor for the heavy presses, upper floors for composing, binding, and storage. Franklin worked in the press room, the most physically demanding position. Operating a hand press required significant strength and stamina. A pressman would ink the type, position the paper, pull the heavy lever that brought the platen down onto the type, lift the platen, remove the printed sheet, and repeat the process hundreds of times per day. It was exhausting work that left men's backs aching and their hands blistered. But Franklin thrived on it. He was young, strong, and motivated. He worked faster and more accurately than most of his fellow pressmen, earning good wages and the respect of his employers. He lived frugally, saving his wages with the same discipline he applied to his work. While other young journeymen spent their money in taverns and gaming houses, Franklin paid his modest rent, bought simple food, and spent what little spare money he had on books. His lodgings were in a boarding house in Little Britain, a neighbourhood near St. Paul's Cathedral. He rented a small room, barely large enough for a bed and a small table, in a house full of other working men. The landlady provided simple meals: bread, cheese, and beer for breakfast, meat and vegetables for dinner. Franklin often skipped the beer, saving the money and avoiding the drowsiness that followed drinking. He spent his free time exploring London's intellectual life, a world that opened up possibilities he'd never imagined. London was the centre of the English-speaking world's literary and scientific culture. Coffee houses served as informal universities, where writers, thinkers, and dilettantes gathered to read newspapers, discuss the latest publications, and debate everything from poetry to politics. Franklin became a regular at several coffee houses, particularly those near the print shops where he worked. For the price of a cup of coffee, a man could spend hours reading newspapers and journals that would have cost a week's wages to purchase. He could listen to conversations between educated men, learn about new ideas, and sometimes contribute his own thoughts. He visited bookshops, spending hours browsing volumes he couldn't afford to buy, but could read in part while standing in the shop. Booksellers generally tolerated this practice as long as customers were respectful and didn't damage the merchandise. Franklin would memorize passages from books he particularly admired, then return to his room to transcribe them from memory, testing his recall and absorbing the author's style. He befriended other young men of intellectual ambition. James Ralph, a would-be poet who'd also come from Philadelphia. Charles Osborne and James Watson, aspiring writers who shared Franklin's love of literature. Together, they formed an informal club, meeting to share their writings, critique each other's work, and discuss books they'd read. During this time, Franklin wrote and printed a pamphlet titled A Dissertation on Liberty and Necessity, Pleasure and Pain. It was a work of youthful philosophy, only about 4,000 words long, but it demonstrated his ability to construct logical arguments on the deepest questions. The pamphlet argued that if God is all-powerful and all-knowing, then free will is an illusion and morality is meaningless. Everything is predetermined by God's eternal knowledge. If God knew from eternity what every person would do, then those actions couldn't be otherwise. Therefore, no one truly chooses to be virtuous or vicious. Vice and virtue are equally natural, equally determined by God's plan. It was clever reasoning, but it led to conclusions Benjamin would later reject as naive and dangerous. The pamphlet made him some influential friends, including William Lyons, a surgeon and amateur scientist who was impressed by the young American's reasoning ability. But it also taught Franklin a lesson about ideas. Some thoughts are better left unpublished, or at least published with more maturity and consideration of their practical consequences. The moral relativism he'd argued for in the pamphlet would later seem to him not just wrong, but harmful. If morality has no basis, if virtue is meaningless, then what prevents society from descending into chaos? Franklin would spend much of his later life developing a practical ethical framework that avoided both religious dogmatism and moral nihilism. Despite his intellectual pursuits and steady employment, Benjamin was lonely. London offered endless distractions: theatres, pleasure gardens, taverns, brothels. But these cost money and ultimately left him feeling empty. He'd left behind Deborah Reed in Philadelphia, with vague promises of marriage once he established himself. He'd written her often during his first months in London, pouring out his thoughts and feelings, describing the city, assuring her of his continued affection. But gradually, the letters stopped. The distance was too great, the obstacles too numerous. He was an ocean away with no prospects of returning soon. Deborah was young and would have other suitors. Their understanding, never formalized, simply lapsed. Franklin later admitted that he felt guilty about this abandonment, recognizing that he'd wronged her through his neglect. He met other women in London, had brief affairs that left no lasting impression in the historical record. The city offered plenty of opportunities for a young man to indulge his appetites, and Franklin was no saint. But these encounters, whatever they were, didn't fill the void left by genuine connection. London also taught Franklin about the rigid class system that governed English society, a system far more inflexible than anything in the colonies. In America, at least in theory, a man could rise through talent and industry. In England, birth determined destiny almost absolutely. The aristocracy occupied a separate world, living in townhouses in Mayfair and Westminster, attended by armies of servants, moving in circles that ordinary tradesmen could never penetrate. Below them were the gentry, the wealthy merchants, the professionals. Then came the skilled tradesmen like Franklin. Below them, the unskilled labourers, the servants, the poor. Each class had its own dress, speech, manners, and expectations. Movement between classes was rare and difficult. A journeyman printer might become a master printer and perhaps grow modestly wealthy, but he'd never be a gentleman, never be received in aristocratic society, never be considered truly respectable by those above him. Franklin observed all this with his characteristic analytical detachment, noting the absurdity of a system that judged men by birth rather than merit. The experience reinforced his belief in the American experiment, where class lines, though they existed, were more porous and negotiable. By the spring of 1726, Benjamin had decided that London, magnificent as it was, would never offer him the opportunities he sought. The city was too established, too hierarchical, too bound by tradition. Here, he'd always be a skilled worker, respected within his trade but limited by it. In America, a man could rise. The opportunities there were real. The society more fluid. A printer who built a successful business could become a gentleman, could be respected, not despite his origins, but because of his achievements. He found a merchant named Thomas Denham, who was returning to Philadelphia and needed a clerk. Denham offered Benjamin a job in his store, promising to teach him the merchant's trade. It meant leaving printing temporarily, but it offered passage home and the chance to learn another useful skill. Merchants could become wealthy in ways that journeyman printers never could. In July 1726, Benjamin Franklin boarded a ship bound for Philadelphia. He was 20 years old, returning with no more money than he'd left with 2 years earlier, but immeasurably richer in experience and knowledge. He'd worked in the finest print shops in the English-speaking world, learning techniques and standards that few American printers possessed. He'd conversed with London's intellectuals and observed the life of a great city. He'd tested himself in the largest city on earth and not been found wanting. The voyage home took 11 weeks, far longer than usual due to contrary winds and storms. The ship was blown off course repeatedly. Supplies ran low. The crew and passengers began to fear they'd run out of food and water before reaching land. Benjamin spent the time writing, recording his observations about the natural world with the same careful attention he applied to everything. He studied the ocean, noting the behavior of dolphins that swam alongside the ship. He observed how they communicated with each other through sounds and movements. He watched them hunt fish, coordinating their efforts with what seemed like intelligence and planning. He studied the properties of water itself, noting how it behaved in waves, how it responded to wind, how temperature affected its density. He made calculations about the ship's speed and position, trying to determine where they were when clouds obscured the stars needed for navigation. He also recorded his thoughts on moral philosophy, beginning to develop the ethical framework that would guide his later life. In these shipboard writings, we can see him moving away from the moral relativism of his dissertation on liberty and necessity toward a more practical understanding of virtue. He began to articulate ideas that would later become famous. That virtue is its own reward, that doing good makes us happy, that society depends on mutual cooperation and trust, that a reputation for honesty is more valuable than immediate advantage gained through deception. These weren't original philosophical insights. Countless thinkers before Franklin had articulated similar ideas, but Franklin was making them his own, testing them against his experience, converting abstract principles into practical rules for living. When the ship finally arrived in Philadelphia in October 1726, Benjamin Franklin stepped ashore a different person from the 18-year-old who'd left. He'd seen the world beyond colonial America. He'd tested himself and proven his abilities. He'd learned what he wanted and where he could find it. He was home, and he was ready to begin again. Philadelphia felt different now. Smaller, certainly, after London's vastness, but also more welcoming, more full of possibility. He resumed work as a printer, first in Thomas Denham's employment doing clerical work. But when Denham died suddenly a few months later, Benjamin returned to his true calling. He went back to work for Samuel Keimer, the eccentric printer who'd first employed him. The relationship was different now. Benjamin had worked in London's finest print shops. He had skills that far exceeded anything Keimer possessed. The arrangement couldn't last. Meanwhile, Benjamin discovered that his absence had cost him dearly in another way. Deborah Reed, the girl he'd courted before leaving for London, had married another man, a potter named John Rogers, who turned out to be a scoundrel with a wife already living in England. Rogers fled Philadelphia to escape debts and possible bigamy charges, leaving Deborah in an impossible position. She couldn't remarry while Rogers lived, but she couldn't find him to obtain a divorce. She was married and abandoned, trapped by the legal realities of the time. Benjamin, partly responsible for her situation through his own neglect, could only watch and regret. But there would be time to address that situation later. First, he needed to establish himself. In 1727, at age 21, Benjamin made two decisions that would shape the rest of his life. First, he gathered a group of young tradesmen and artisans to form a club dedicated to mutual improvement. They called it the junto, a Spanish word meaning join together. The junto met every Friday evening to discuss questions of morals, politics, and natural philosophy. Each member took turns proposing topics for debate. Is it permissible to tell a small lie to spare someone's feelings? What's the best form of government? Should the wealthy be required to support the poor? The discussions were structured, earnest, and remarkably sophisticated for a group of young men in their early 20s. But the junto was more than a debating society. Members helped each other in business, shared books, and formed connections that would last for decades. Benjamin's closest friends for the rest of his life came from the junto. It was his first experiment in creating what he called voluntary associations, organizations of citizens working together for mutual benefit. The second crucial decision was to establish his own printing business. He formed a partnership with Hugh Meredith, a fellow worker at Keimer's shop, whose father agreed to provide the capital. In 1728, Franklin and Meredith opened their own print shop on Market Street. The timing was perfect. Keimer's business was failing due to his poor management and difficult personality. When Pennsylvania's government needed a printer, Franklin and Meredith submitted a bid and won the contract. Government printing provided steady income and credibility. Within a year, the partnership dissolved amicably when Meredith's drinking problems became unmanageable, and he decided to pursue farming instead. Franklin bought out his partner's share with borrowed money, and at age 24 became the sole proprietor of his own printing business. He worked with relentless energy, up before dawn, working late into the night, personally hauling paper through the streets in a wheelbarrow to demonstrate his industry. While other tradesmen spent their evenings in taverns, Franklin was at his press. His shop became known for producing the highest quality work in Philadelphia, delivered on time at fair prices. In 1729, Franklin bought a failing newspaper called the Pennsylvania Gazette and transformed it into the most successful paper in the colonies. He wrote many of the articles himself, mixing news with essays, humor, and practical information. The Gazette was lively, readable, and profitable. He also began publishing pamphlets on public issues. When Pennsylvania's legislature debated whether to issue paper currency, Franklin wrote a modest inquiry into the nature and necessity of a paper currency, arguing persuasively for the measure. The pamphlet swayed public opinion. The currency was issued, and Franklin's print shop received the lucrative contract to print the money. But his most successful publication was yet to come. In December 1732, Franklin published the first edition of Poor Richard's Almanac, a yearly calendar filled with weather predictions, astronomical information, and pithy sayings. Poor Richard was supposedly written by Richard Saunders, a henpecked husband who needed money. Everyone knew Franklin was the real author. The almanac featured his wit, his wisdom, and his genius for memorable phrases. Early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. A penny saved is a penny earned. Fish and visitors stink after 3 days. God helps them that help themselves. 3 may keep a secret if 2 of them are dead. The sayings mixed practical advice with wry humor. They celebrated industry, thrift, and common sense while mocking pretension and laziness. They became embedded in American culture, shaping the national character for generations. Poor Richard's Almanac sold 10,000 copies a year, an extraordinary number for colonial America. It made Franklin financially comfortable and culturally influential. He continued publishing it for 25 years, and it remained profitable throughout. By his late 20s, Benjamin Franklin had achieved remarkable success. He owned the most successful printing business in Philadelphia. He published the most widely read newspaper and almanac in the colonies. He was making money, building a reputation, and positioning himself for even greater achievements. But he was also building a home. In 1730, he entered into a common law marriage with Deborah Red. Deborah's legal situation remained complicated. Her husband, John Rogers, was alive somewhere, which meant she couldn't legally remarry. But Rogers wasn't coming back, and the couple decided to live as husband and wife despite the legal technicality. It was a practical arrangement, and by all accounts, a happy one. Deborah was intelligent, hard-working, and managed Franklin's household and business affairs when he traveled. She ran the print shop's retail operations, selling books, paper, and other goods. She was a full partner in the enterprise. Their household included Benjamin's illegitimate son, William, born around 1730 to a woman whose identity Franklin never revealed. Deborah raised William as her own, a generous act that speaks to her character. The couple had 2 children together, Francis and Sarah. Tragically, Francis died of smallpox at age 4, a loss that devastated both parents. Franklin's daily routine during these years established patterns that would last his lifetime. He rose early, often before dawn. He spent an hour in what he called powerful thinking, planning his day and examining his progress towards self-improvement. He worked through the morning at his printing business. He took a simple lunch, usually bread and butter. He worked through the afternoon. In the evening, he read, wrote, or attended junto meetings. He allocated his time carefully, believing that wasted hours were lost forever. He developed a system of moral self-improvement based on 13 virtues: temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, moderation, cleanliness, tranquility, chastity, and humility. He created a small book with a page for each virtue, marked into columns for each day of the week. Every evening, he'd mark his failures for that day with black dots. His goal was to achieve a clean page for each virtue before moving to the next. The project was characteristically systematic and characteristically Franklin. He never achieved perfection, but the process of trying shaped his character. The virtue he struggled with most was order, admitting that his papers and business affairs were often in disarray, despite his best intentions. By his own assessment and that of his contemporaries, Franklin's disciplined approach to self-improvement worked. He became known for his industry, his fairness in business, his reliability, and his intellectual curiosity. By age 30, Franklin's printing business was so successful that he could afford to hire managers and reduce his own direct involvement. This gave him time to pursue other interests, and it was at this point that Benjamin Franklin began to transform from a successful tradesman into something far more remarkable. He'd become a scientist, an inventor, and a philosopher whose discoveries would echo through the centuries. The transformation began with questions. Why does smoke rise in a chimney? Why are some fabrics warmer than others? What causes the aurora borealis? Franklin approached these puzzles not as abstract curiosities, but as practical problems that might yield practical solutions. His first significant invention addressed a common problem in colonial homes: inefficient heating. Traditional fireplaces sent most of their heat up the chimney while filling rooms with smoke. Franklin designed a cast-iron stove that could be placed in the middle of a room, radiating heat in all directions while venting smoke safely outside. The Pennsylvania fireplace, as he called it, was a marvel of practical engineering. It used significantly less wood than a traditional fireplace, while producing much more heat. It made homes more comfortable and reduced the back-breaking labor of chopping and hauling firewood. The governor of Pennsylvania offered Franklin a patent, which would have made him wealthy from the invention. Franklin refused. His reasoning was characteristic. As we enjoy great advantages from the inventions of others, we should be glad of an opportunity to serve others by any invention of ours, and this we should do freely and generously. He published detailed plans for the stove so that anyone could build or improve upon it. This pattern of sharing discoveries freely rather than profiting from them would define his scientific career. But the work that would make Franklin internationally famous was still ahead. It began with a simple observation about lightning. In the early 1740s, Franklin became fascinated by electricity, then one of the most mysterious phenomena in natural philosophy. European scientists had discovered that certain materials, when rubbed, could attract small objects or produce sparks. They called it the electric fire, and elaborate demonstrations of electrical phenomena had become popular entertainment among the wealthy. Traveling lecturers would perform electrical tricks for paying audiences. They'd charge a person with electricity until sparks flew from their fingertips. They'd make objects dance and move through invisible electrical forces. They'd create spectacular sparks and glowing halos. But despite these dramatic demonstrations, no one truly understood what electricity was, how it worked, or what fundamental principles governed it. Franklin first encountered electrical demonstrations in Boston in 1746, when a traveling lecturer named Dr. Archibald Spencer performed experiments for fascinated audiences. Franklin attended one of these demonstrations and was immediately captivated. Here was a natural phenomenon that was clearly real, clearly powerful, but completely mysterious. It was exactly the kind of puzzle that appealed to his practical, systematic mind. He began conducting experiments, first learning everything that others had discovered, then pushing beyond into unexplored territory. He acquired a Leyden jar from Peter Collinson, a London merchant and amateur scientist who became one of Franklin's most important correspondents. The Leyden jar was a device that could store electrical charge, essentially the first electrical capacitor. It consisted of a glass jar with metal foil coating the inside and outside surfaces, and it could deliver a powerful shock when discharged. Franklin began systematically testing its properties, conducting experiment after experiment, recording his observations with meticulous care. He'd charge the jar and then test what happened when he touched various parts of it. He discovered that the charge resided not in the metal foil, but in the glass itself, in what he called the electric matter trapped between the two conducting surfaces. Through careful experimentation, Franklin made several crucial discoveries that would transform scientific understanding of electricity. He identified positive and negative electrical charges, the terms we still use today. He realized that electricity wasn't created when objects were rubbed together, but rather transferred from one object to another. An object that gained electricity, what he called positive, did so at the expense of another object that lost electricity, what he called negative. This was a fundamental insight. Previous experimenters had thought there were two different kinds of electricity that could be created through friction. Franklin proved there was only one kind. An electrical phenomena resulted from imbalances in the distribution of this single electrical fluid. He demonstrated that electrical charge is conserved, that it flows from one place to another, rather than being created or destroyed. In a series of ingenious experiments, he showed that the total amount of electrical charge in a closed system remains constant. If one object gains a positive charge, another must have lost an equal amount, becoming negatively charged. This principle of conservation would become one of the foundations of electrical science, with implications that extended far beyond Franklin's experiments. Franklin also developed the concept of electrical grounding, demonstrating that electrical charge would flow into the earth if given a conducting path. This observation would prove crucial for his most famous invention, the lightning rod. He conducted experiments showing that electrical charge concentrated at pointed objects, a phenomenon he called the power of points. When a charged object was brought near a sharp point, the electrical charge would stream off the point in what Franklin described as an electrical wind. But the discovery that would make Franklin internationally famous came from a bold hypothesis. Lightning was electrical in nature, the same phenomenon that produced sparks when you shuffled across a carpet in winter, only on a vastly larger scale. The idea wasn't entirely original. Several European scientists had speculated about the possibility, but Franklin was the first to propose a practical experiment to test it definitively, and he was the first to actually conduct such a test successfully. He initially proposed using a tall pointed rod erected on a hill or tall building. During a thunderstorm, if lightning was indeed electrical, the rod should become charged and produce sparks when a grounded conductor was brought near its base. He wrote up this proposal and sent it to his London correspondents, suggesting that someone should attempt the experiment. In France, Franklin's proposal was read with great interest. In May 1752, French scientists successfully conducted the experiment at Marly-la-Ville near Paris using a 40-foot iron rod erected in an open field. During a thunderstorm, sparks flew from the rod, proving that storm clouds were indeed electrically charged. The experiment was repeated across Europe with the same results. Franklin's hypothesis was confirmed before he'd conducted his own test, but Franklin, unaware of the European experiments, was still planning his demonstration. He'd intended to conduct it from the top of Christ Church's steeple in Philadelphia, which was then under construction. When construction delays prevented this approach, Franklin designed an alternative method that has become the most famous scientific experiment in American history. The experiment took place in Philadelphia in June 1752, though the exact date is uncertain. Franklin had designed a kite with a wire attached to its tip, extending about a foot above the kite. The kite was made of silk rather than paper to better withstand the wet conditions of a thunderstorm. He attached a metal key to the hemp string near the bottom, and between the key and his hand he tied a silk ribbon. Silk, being an insulator when dry, would protect him from electrical shock. Franklin and his son William went to a field on the outskirts of Philadelphia as storm clouds gathered. They raised the kite and waited. As rain began to fall, nothing happened. The hemp string was dry, and dry hemp is a poor conductor of electricity. But as the rain continued and the string became thoroughly wet, something remarkable occurred. The loose fibers of the hemp string began to stand erect, repelled by the electrical charge they were conducting. Franklin knew immediately that his hypothesis was correct. He brought his knuckle close to the metal key and drew a spark, then another. He could draw sparks repeatedly from the key as long as the storm lasted. Lightning was electricity. The heavens and the laboratory were governed by the same principles. Franklin had proved it through direct experimentation. The experiment was extraordinarily dangerous, and Franklin was fortunate not to have been killed. He later learned of several European scientists who attempted similar experiments and died from electrical shock. Franklin's survival was partly luck and partly his careful use of the silk ribbon insulator, but the risk was real, and he later cautioned others against attempting such direct experiments with lightning. He published his findings in letters to Peter Collinson, who shared them with the Royal Society of London. These letters were compiled into a book, Experiments and Observations on Electricity, made at Philadelphia in America. The work was published in London in 1751 and quickly translated into French, German, and Italian. The response from the European scientific community was immediate and enthusiastic. Here was original research of the highest quality, conducted not in a well-funded European laboratory, but in a colonial print shop by a self-taught natural philosopher. Franklin's careful experimental method, his clear reasoning, his practical insights, all marked him as a scientist of the first rank. The Royal Society of London awarded him the Copley Medal in 1753, their highest honour, equivalent to what would later become the Nobel Prize. The citation praised his curious experiments and observations on electricity. Yale College awarded him an honorary Master of Arts degree in 1753. Harvard followed with the same honour. The University of St Andrews in Scotland made him a Doctor of Laws in 1759. Oxford University granted him a Doctor of Civil Law degree in 1762. The boy who never finished formal schooling was now Dr. Franklin, honoured by the most prestigious universities in the English-speaking world. He was elected to the Royal Society in 1756, joining Newton, Boyle, and the other giants of scientific inquiry. But Franklin's interest in electricity was never purely theoretical. He immediately applied his discoveries to practical problems, demonstrating the pragmatic genius that defined his entire scientific career. If lightning was electrical, then buildings could be protected from lightning strikes by installing metal rods that would conduct the charge safely into the ground. The pointed rod would attract the electrical charge from storm clouds. The metal would conduct it down the side of the building, and a wire buried in the earth would dissipate the charge harmlessly into the ground. Franklin invented the lightning rod in 1752 and published instructions for installing them. Within a few years, they were being installed on buildings throughout America and Europe. Churches, which were often the tallest structures in their communities and frequently struck by lightning, were among the first to adopt the new technology. The impact was immediate and dramatic. Buildings that would have burned were protected. The terrifying phenomenon of a lightning strike, often interpreted as divine judgment, became manageable through human ingenuity. How many structures were saved from fire by this simple invention? How many lives preserved? The number is beyond counting, but it's certainly in the thousands, perhaps tens of thousands over the centuries since Franklin's invention. There was religious opposition, of course. Some clergy argued that lightning rods were impious, an attempt to interfere with God's will. If God wanted to strike a building with lightning, who were humans to prevent it? But the practical benefit was so obvious that the objections faded quickly. Even the most pious recognized that using human reason to understand natural phenomena and protect human life wasn't contrary to God's purposes. He also invented bifocal glasses, allowing people to see both near and far without changing spectacles. He invented the flexible urinary catheter to help his brother John, who suffered from bladder stones. He studied ocean currents and created the first chart of the Gulf Stream, helping ships cross the Atlantic more quickly. He developed a phonetic alphabet to make English spelling more logical. He invented a glass harmonica, a musical instrument that Mozart and Beethoven would compose for. Every invention, every discovery was motivated by practical benefit. How can we make life better, safer, more comfortable, more efficient? This was Franklin's constant question. By the early 1750s, Benjamin Franklin had achieved more than most men accomplish in a full lifetime. He was financially independent, scientifically renowned, and actively involved in improving his community through the voluntary associations he'd helped create. The Junto had spun off numerous projects. Franklin had founded America's first subscription library in 1731, allowing members to pool resources to purchase books that no individual could afford. The Library Company of Philadelphia still exists today. He'd helped establish Pennsylvania's first fire insurance company, using the principle of mutual aid to protect citizens from catastrophic loss. He'd organized the Union Fire Company, Philadelphia's first volunteer fire department. He'd founded the American Philosophical Society, modeled on the Royal Society of London to advance scientific knowledge. He'd helped establish Pennsylvania Hospital, America's first general hospital, and the Academy of Philadelphia, which would grow into the University of Pennsylvania. In each case, Franklin's method was the same. Identify a need, propose a solution, gather others to support it, and implement it through voluntary cooperation. He had a genius for organization and an ability to convince others to contribute to the common good. But as the 1750s progressed, Franklin's attention was increasingly drawn away from science and civic improvement toward politics. The relationship between Britain's American colonies and the mother country was becoming strained, and Franklin would find himself at the center of the crisis that would tear the empire apart and create a new nation. The shift from scientist to statesman was gradual but inexorable. In 1751, Franklin was elected to the Pennsylvania Assembly, the colony's legislative body. It was the beginning of a political career that would last until the end of his life. His first major political project was the Albany Plan of Union, proposed in 1754. Representatives from 7 colonies gathered in Albany, New York, to discuss common defense against French and Indian threats. Franklin proposed that the colonies form a unified government for matters of defense and westward expansion, while maintaining their individual identities for local affairs. The plan was visionary, prefiguring the federal structure that would eventually govern the United States. But it was rejected by both the colonial assemblies, who feared losing power, and the British government, which feared the colonies becoming too independent. Yet the idea had been planted. Colonial unity was possible, even if not yet achievable. In 1757, the Pennsylvania Assembly sent Franklin to London as their agent, tasked with representing colonial interests to the British government. It was supposed to be a temporary mission. Franklin would remain abroad for most of the next 18 years. He sailed from Philadelphia in June 1757, leaving Deborah behind. She refused to cross the ocean, terrified of sea travel. William, now grown and appointed royal governor of New Jersey, accompanied his father. They wouldn't return to Philadelphia until 1762, and even then only briefly. London in the 1750s was familiar to Franklin from his youthful residence 3 decades earlier, but his circumstances had changed dramatically. He was no longer an anonymous journeyman printer, but an internationally famous scientist and colonial representative. He was welcomed into the best intellectual circles. He dined with members of Parliament, corresponded with leading scientists, and became friends with some of the most influential thinkers in Britain. David Hume, the great philosopher, became a close friend. Lord Kames, Adam Smith, Joseph Priestley, all valued his company and conversation. He was inducted into the Royal Society of London and attended meetings regularly, contributing to discussions on everything from the salinity of seawater to the effectiveness of smallpox inoculation. But his primary mission was political, and here he faced increasing frustration. The British government was beginning to view the American colonies as sources of revenue rather than as self-governing entities within the empire. New taxes and regulations were being considered, designed to make the colonies pay for their own defense and contribute to Britain's imperial expenses. Franklin worked to educate British officials about American realities. The colonists, he argued, were loyal British subjects who simply wanted to be treated fairly. They would gladly contribute to the empire's well-being if asked properly, but they resented being taxed without representation in Parliament. His arguments fell on deaf ears. The British political class viewed Americans as ungrateful provincials who needed to be reminded of their subordinate status. In 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act, requiring that newspapers, legal documents, and other papers carry a tax stamp purchased from the British government. It was the first direct tax imposed on the colonies by Parliament, and the reaction was explosive. Americans rioted in the streets. They burned stamp distributors in effigy, destroyed property, and organised boycotts of British goods. The cry of no taxation without representation echoed through every colonial town. Franklin, in London, initially thought the colonists were overreacting, but when he testified before Parliament in February 1766, he delivered a masterful defence of the American position. He explained that the colonists distinguish between external taxes, tariffs on trade, and internal taxes, direct taxation of colonial economic activity. They would accept the former as regulation of trade, but viewed the latter as tyranny. His testimony was published and widely read. It helped persuade Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act, though they simultaneously passed the Declaratory Act, asserting their right to tax the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The crisis was postponed, not resolved. Franklin remained in London, hoping to bridge the growing divide between Britain and America. He continued to represent Pennsylvania and eventually Georgia, New Jersey, and Massachusetts as well. He was America's primary voice in London. But events were moving beyond his control. The British government continued pushing for revenue from the colonies. The Townshend Acts of 1767 imposed new taxes on glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. Again, Americans resisted. Again, boycotts were organized. Tensions escalated. In 1770, British soldiers in Boston fired on a crowd of protesters, killing 5. The Boston Massacre became a rallying cry for colonial resistance. Franklin watched with growing alarm as the situation deteriorated. He published anonymous essays in British newspapers, satirizing British policy and defending American rights. He tried to use his personal connections to influence policy, but the British government was determined to assert its authority, and American colonists were equally determined to resist. The breaking point came in December 1773, when Boston radicals, disguised as Mohawk Indians, dumped 342 chests of British tea into Boston Harbor to protest the Tea Act. The Boston Tea Party was an act of defiance that the British government couldn't ignore. Parliament responded with the coercive acts, called the Intolerable Acts in America. Boston's port was closed. Massachusetts's charter was revoked. A military governor was appointed. British troops would be quartered in private homes if necessary. Franklin was in London when news of these measures arrived. He knew they would push the colonies toward rebellion. He made one final effort at reconciliation, proposing compromises that might satisfy both sides. But in January 1774, he was summoned before the Privy Council. What followed was one of the most humiliating experiences of Franklin's life. He was publicly accused of stealing letters from the Massachusetts governor and sending them to Boston to inflame resistance. He was called a thief and a liar. The Solicitor General, Alexander Wedderburn, delivered an hour-long speech attacking Franklin's character, his honesty, his loyalty to the crown. Franklin stood silent throughout the abuse, his face expressionless. But inside, something broke. He had spent 18 years trying to preserve the British Empire through reasonable compromise. That effort was over. In March 1775, Franklin left London and sailed for Philadelphia. He arrived on May 5, 1775, to find that war had already begun. British troops and colonial militia had clashed at Lexington and Concord 3 weeks earlier. The American Revolution had started. At age 69, Benjamin Franklin was about to help create a nation. The Pennsylvania Assembly elected Franklin as a delegate to the Second Continental Congress the day after he arrived in Philadelphia. He immediately became one of the most influential voices in that body, second only to George Washington. Franklin was assigned to numerous committees. He helped draft the Declaration of Independence, though the primary author was Thomas Jefferson. Franklin made several important edits to Jefferson's draft, including changing "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable" to the more elegant and forceful "We hold these truths to be self-evident." On July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. Franklin was one of the first to sign it, affixing his name to a document that declared him a traitor to the British Crown. If the revolution failed, he would hang. But Franklin's most crucial service to the revolution wouldn't take place in America. In September 1776, Congress appointed him commissioner to France, tasked with securing French military and financial support for the American cause. He sailed in October 1776, at age 70, crossing the Atlantic in wartime, risking capture by British warships. The voyage took 6 weeks. He arrived in France in December and immediately set to work on the most important diplomatic mission of his life. The French court was initially cautious. France had been Britain's enemy for centuries, and the prospect of weakening Britain by supporting the American rebels was attractive. But open alliance with revolutionaries was risky. If America lost, France would have wasted resources and antagonized Britain for nothing. Franklin's task was to convince France that America would win, that French support would be rewarded with trade and alliance, and that this was France's opportunity to redress the balance of power in Europe. He approached the challenge with the same practical genius he'd applied to everything else in his life. Rather than dressing like a European courtier in silk and powder, Franklin presented himself as a simple American in a plain brown coat and a fur cap. He cultivated the image of the noble rustic philosopher from the New World, wise but unpretentious, natural rather than artificial. The French adored him. Parisian society embraced this charming old man who spoke their language imperfectly but eloquently, who understood their philosophers and scientists, who was equally comfortable at Versailles and in a café. Women found him fascinating. Intellectuals sought his conversation. His image appeared on medallions, snuff boxes, and prints throughout Paris, but beneath the charm was serious diplomatic work. Franklin negotiated, lobbied, gathered intelligence, and cultivated relationships with every influential figure in French politics. He worked with Silas Deane and Arthur Lee, the other American commissioners, though both men proved difficult colleagues. The breakthrough came in October 1777, when news reached Paris of the American victory at Saratoga. General Horatio Gates had defeated a British army under General Burgoyne, capturing over 5,000 troops. It was proof that America could win battles against British regulars. France decided to commit. In February 1778, Franklin signed 2 treaties with the French government. The Treaty of Amity and Commerce established trade relations. The Treaty of Alliance bound France to military support for American independence, committing French troops, ships, and money to the American cause. It was the diplomatic triumph that made American victory possible. Without French support, the revolution likely would have failed. Washington's army was perpetually undermanned, undersupplied, and outmatched by professional British forces. French military aid, including the crucial naval support at Yorktown in 1781, tipped the balance. Franklin remained in France for the duration of the war, managing the complex relationship between allies who spoke different languages and had different goals. He secured loans and supplies. He handled prisoner exchanges. He countered British propaganda. He lived in a beautiful estate in Passy, on the outskirts of Paris, where he entertained constantly and conducted his diplomatic work with grace and skill. He also found time to enjoy himself. He flirted with intelligent French women, including the brilliant Madame Helvétius, a widow whom he actually proposed to. She declined. He attended salons and scientific lectures. He published essays and invented new devices, including bifocal glasses, during this period. In 1781, British General Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown. The war was effectively over, though peace negotiations dragged on for 2 more years. Franklin was appointed one of the American Peace Commissioners, along with John Adams and John Jay. The Treaty of Paris, signed in September 1783, recognized American independence and established generous boundaries for the new nation. Franklin's diplomatic skill was crucial in securing these terms. He played Britain, France, and Spain off against each other, maximizing American gains while maintaining friendships where possible. At 77 years old, Benjamin Franklin had helped midwife a nation into existence. His diplomatic achievements rivaled any in American history, but he was tired and he wanted to go home. He requested permission to return to America in 1785. Congress granted it reluctantly, as Franklin was irreplaceable in Paris. He said his farewells, received honors from the French court, and in July 1785 boarded a ship for Philadelphia. He would never see Europe again. The remaining 5 years of his life would be spent in the nation he had helped create, contributing to its final founding act. Franklin arrived in Philadelphia in September 1785 to a hero's welcome. Cannons fired salutes, bells rang throughout the city, crowds lined the streets. At 79 years old, after 9 years abroad, he was home. He moved into a house on Market Street that his daughter Sarah and her husband Richard Bache had prepared for him. Deborah had died in 1774, while Franklin was in London, a loss that haunted him with guilt for not having been there. But his daughter provided a loving household, and his grandchildren brought joy to his final years. He could have retired completely, resting on his extraordinary achievements. But retirement was not in Benjamin Franklin's nature. Almost immediately, he was drawn back into public service. Pennsylvania elected him president of the Supreme Executive Council, essentially governor of the state, a position he held for 3 years. At the same time, he was dealing with painful physical ailments. He suffered from gout, kidney stones, and other afflictions of old age. The kidney stones were particularly agonizing, and he began using laudanum, opium dissolved in alcohol, to manage the pain. Yet in 1787, when Pennsylvania selected delegates to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, Franklin was chosen despite his age and infirmity. He was the oldest delegate present, nearly twice the age of most attendees. The Constitutional Convention met from May to September 1787, tasked with creating a new framework for the federal government. The Articles of Confederation, under which the nation had operated since independence, were proving inadequate. The federal government was too weak to govern effectively. Franklin attended nearly every session, though he said little during the debates. His physical condition made prolonged speaking difficult, and his voice, never strong, had weakened with age. But when he did speak, everyone listened. The convention nearly collapsed several times over disputes between large and small states, slave and free states, commercial and agricultural interests. The delegates were brilliant men with strong opinions, and compromise seemed impossible. At the crucial moment, when the convention appeared ready to break up without agreement, Franklin delivered a speech that he had written out and asked James Wilson to read on his behalf. The speech was both humble and wise, acknowledging that no one had all the answers, that this constitution would be imperfect, but that it was the best compromise possible. I confess that there are several parts of this constitution which I do not at present approve, Franklin admitted, but I am not sure I shall never approve them. For having lived long, I have experienced many instances of being obliged by better information or fuller consideration to change opinions even on important subjects which I once thought right, but found to be otherwise. He urged the delegates to doubt their own infallibility and support the document despite its flaws. His speech helped break the deadlock. Delegates who had been intransigent reconsidered. The Constitution was completed and signed on September 17, 1787. Franklin was one of the signers, his shaking hand guided across the page. He was now the only person to have signed all 4 founding documents of the United States: the Declaration of Independence, the Treaty of Alliance with France, the Treaty of Paris, and the Constitution. As he signed, he looked at the sun painted on the back of the president's chair and remarked to those nearby that throughout the convention he had wondered whether it was a rising or setting sun. But now at length I have the happiness to know that it is a rising and not a setting sun. It was a characteristically optimistic observation from a man who had seen America rise from colonial dependence to independent nation. Franklin's final years were spent largely at home, surrounded by family and visited by admirers from around the world. His house became a pilgrimage site for those who wanted to meet the great philosopher and statesman. He continued writing, working on his autobiography in sections when strength permitted. The autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, though never completed, would become one of the most influential books in American history, teaching generations the value of self-improvement, industry, and practical wisdom. He also turned his attention to one final moral crusade. Having owned slaves earlier in his life, Franklin had gradually come to see slavery as a moral abomination. In his final years, he became president of the Pennsylvania Society for promoting the abolition of slavery. In February 1790, just weeks before his death, he signed a petition to Congress calling for the abolition of slavery. It was one of his last public acts, a reminder that even in his 80s, Franklin was still fighting for human freedom and dignity. By early 1790, it was clear that Franklin's body was failing. The kidney stones caused constant agony. He could barely walk. He spent most of his time in bed, reading, receiving visitors, and managing his pain with increasing doses of laudanum. On April 17, 1790, Benjamin Franklin died in his bed at home, surrounded by family. He was 84 years old. The cause was likely complications from the kidney stones and general organ failure. News of his death spread quickly through Philadelphia and then across the nation and to Europe. The tributes were extraordinary. The French National Assembly declared 3 days of mourning, the first time that body had honored a foreigner. The American Congress wore mourning badges for a month. His funeral, held on April 21st, was the largest Philadelphia had ever seen. 20,000 people, half the city's population, attended. They followed the casket to Christ Church Burial Ground, where Franklin was laid to rest beside Deborah. His grave marker is simple, as he requested in his will. Benjamin and Deborah Franklin. No titles, no honors, just their names. Visitors still leave pennies on the grave, honoring Poor Richard's wisdom about thrift. But Franklin had also written his own epitaph decades earlier, a playful meditation on his life and beliefs. The body of B. Franklin, printer, like the cover of an old book, its contents torn out and stripped of its lettering and gilding, lies here, food for worms. But the work shall not be wholly lost, for it will, as he believed, appear once more in a new and more perfect edition, corrected and amended by the author. It captured his wit, his optimism, his view of himself as fundamentally a printer, and his hope for something beyond death. Whether he truly believed in the new edition or was simply making an elegant metaphor, we cannot know. But the epitaph was never carved on his tomb. He had asked for simplicity, and simplicity is what he received. The legacy Benjamin Franklin left behind was vast and multifaceted, touching nearly every aspect of American life and extending across the Atlantic to influence European thought as well. As a scientist, his discoveries about electricity transformed human understanding of natural forces. The lightning rod alone saved countless buildings and lives. His fundamental insights about positive and negative charge, about electrical conduction and insulation, laid groundwork for everything from telegraphy to modern power distribution. As an inventor, his practical genius produced devices that made life better. The Franklin stove, bifocals, the flexible catheter, the glass harmonica. Unlike most inventors, he refused to patent his creations, believing that knowledge should be freely shared for the public good. As a writer, his autobiography became required reading for ambitious Americans, teaching self-improvement through discipline and industry. Poor Richard's almanac shaped American values and speech, embedding his wisdom in the language itself. As a civic organizer, he pioneered the concept of voluntary associations working for public benefit. The library, fire company, hospital, and university he helped found in Philadelphia became models copied across America. The idea that citizens could band together to solve community problems without waiting for government or aristocratic patronage was revolutionary. As a diplomat, he secured the French alliance that made American independence possible. His Treaty of Paris established generous boundaries for the new nation. His work in France demonstrated that Americans could hold their own among European sophisticates. As a founding father, he helped draft the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, contributing crucial wisdom at key moments. His presence lent legitimacy and credibility to American independence. But perhaps his most enduring legacy is as the embodiment of a new kind of human being, the self-made American. Born into poverty with no advantages beyond intelligence and determination, Franklin rose to international fame through his own efforts. He proved that in the New World, talent mattered more than birth, that practical wisdom could rival classical education, that a tradesman could become a gentleman through virtue rather than inheritance. The values he championed, industry, frugality, self-improvement, civic responsibility, practical innovation, intellectual curiosity, became core elements of American identity. The American dream owes much to Franklin's example. He was not perfect. He could be vain, calculating, and manipulative. He neglected his wife, probably fathered an illegitimate child, and owned slaves for part of his life. His relationship with his son William, who remained loyal to Britain during the Revolution, ended in permanent estrangement. But his achievements so vastly outweighed his flaws that even his critics acknowledged his greatness. John Adams, who often disagreed with Franklin and resented his popularity, nevertheless called him a great and good man. Today, Franklin's presence remains inescapable in American life. His face appears on the $100 bill. His name graces streets, schools, and institutions across the nation. The organizations he founded, the Library Company, the American Philosophical Society, the University of Pennsylvania, continue their work. His inventions remain in use. His words are quoted daily, often by people who don't realize they're quoting him. Walk into any public library in America, and you're experiencing Franklin's legacy. The concept of free public libraries supported by citizens for mutual benefit was his innovation. Every fire department staffed by volunteers traces back to his Union Fire Company. Every civic organization working to improve communities follows the model he established with the Junto. Scientists studying electricity stand on foundations he laid. Diplomats practicing practical statecraft can look to his example. Writers seeking clear, vigorous prose can study his style. Anyone attempting self-improvement can learn from his methodical approach. Benjamin Franklin never climbed a mountain, but he drew lightning from the sky. He never commanded armies, but he helped win a war. He never held supreme power, but he helped create a nation. The runaway apprentice became one of the most influential human beings in history, and he did it all through curiosity, discipline, and the conviction that ordinary people working together could accomplish extraordinary things. Consider the journey we've traced tonight. From a tallow chandler's shop in Boston to the salons of Paris, from a teenage runaway with bread under his arms to the friend of kings and philosophers, from Poor Richard to the sage of the American Revolution. It was a life that spanned nearly the entire 18th century, that witnessed and helped create the transformation from colonial dependence to national independence. Benjamin Franklin proved that genius could emerge from anywhere, that education could be self-directed, that practical wisdom could rival academic learning, that a tradesman could become a statesman, and that one person's curiosity and effort could genuinely change the world. He was the first American celebrity, the first American scientist of international renown, and in many ways the first recognizably modern American. The values he embodied, pragmatism, innovation, self-reliance, civic duty, and the belief that tomorrow can be better than today, remain central to American identity. 234 years after his death, Benjamin Franklin's light still illuminates. His life reminds us that circumstances of birth need not determine destiny, that knowledge pursued with discipline opens doors, that service to community enriches individual lives, and that one person committed to making things better actually can. The boy who loved to read by candlelight brought electricity to the world. The apprentice who ran away with nothing built institutions that endure. The tradesman who never attended university became a doctor of philosophy in the eyes of the world's finest institutions. At Mount Vernon, in a brick tomb that replaced the old family vault, the view looks out over the Potomac River, constant and unchanging. At Christ Church Burial Ground in Philadelphia, Franklin's grave receives visitors daily, leaving pennies as tribute. The institutions he founded continue. The principles he championed still resonate. The nation he helped create has grown beyond anything he could have imagined, but the fundamental truth he demonstrated remains unchanged. That ordinary people can do extraordinary things when driven by curiosity, disciplined by method, and guided by a commitment to the common good. Franklin's sun was indeed rising, not setting. And in the values he championed, in the institutions he founded, in the precedents he established, that sun still shines. The remaining 5 years of his life would be spent in the nation he helped create, contributing to its final founding act. Franklin arrived in Philadelphia in September 1785 to a hero's welcome. Cannons fired salutes. Bells rang throughout the city. Crowds lined the streets. At 79 years old, after 9 years abroad, he was home. He moved into a house on Market Street that his daughter Sarah and her husband Richard Batch had prepared for him. Deborah had died in 1774 while Franklin was in London, a loss that haunted him with guilt for not having been there. But his daughter provided a loving household, and his grandchildren brought joy to his final years. He could have retired completely, resting on his extraordinary achievements. But retirement was not in Benjamin Franklin's nature. Almost immediately, he was drawn back into public service. Pennsylvania elected him president of the Supreme Executive Council, essentially governor of the state, a position he held for 3 years. At the same time, he was dealing with painful physical ailments. He suffered from gout, kidney stones, and other afflictions of old age. The kidney stones were particularly agonizing, and he began using laudanum, opium dissolved in alcohol, to manage the pain. Yet in 1787, when Pennsylvania selected delegates to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, Franklin was chosen despite his age and infirmity, and he was the oldest delegate present, nearly twice the age of most attendees. The Constitutional Convention met from May to September 1787, tasked with creating a new framework for the federal government. The Articles of Confederation, under which the nation had operated since independence, were proving inadequate. The federal government was too weak to govern effectively. Franklin attended nearly every session, though he said little during the debates. His physical condition made prolonged speaking difficult, and his voice, never strong, had weakened with age. But when he did speak, everyone listened. The convention nearly collapsed several times over disputes between large and small states, slave and free states, commercial and agricultural interests. The delegates were brilliant men with strong opinions, and compromise seemed impossible. At the crucial moment when the convention appeared ready to break up without agreement, Franklin delivered a speech that he had written out and asked James Wilson to read on his behalf. The speech was both humble and wise, acknowledging that no one had all the answers, that this constitution would be imperfect, but that it was the best compromise possible. I confess that there are several parts of this constitution which I do not at present approve, Franklin admitted, but I am not sure I shall never approve them. For having lived long, I have experienced many instances of being obliged by better information or fuller consideration to change opinions even on important subjects, which I once thought right but found to be otherwise. He urged the delegates to doubt their own infallibility and support the document despite its flaws. His speech helped break the deadlock. Delegates who had been intransigent reconsidered. The Constitution was completed and signed on September 17th, 1787. Franklin was one of the signers. His shaking hand guided across the page. He was now the only person to have signed all 4 founding documents of the United States: the Declaration of Independence, the Treaty of Alliance with France, the Treaty of Paris, and the Constitution. As he signed, he looked at the sun painted on the back of the president's chair and remarked to those nearby that throughout the convention he had wondered whether it was a rising or setting sun. But now at length I have the happiness to know that it is a rising and not a setting sun. It was a characteristically optimistic observation from a man who had seen America rise from colonial dependence to independent nation. Franklin's final years were spent largely at home, surrounded by family and visited by admirers from around the world. His house became a pilgrimage site for those who wanted to meet the great philosopher and statesman. He continued writing, working on his autobiography, in sections when strength permitted. The autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, though never completed, would become one of the most influential books in American history, teaching generations the value of self-improvement, industry, and practical wisdom. He also turned his attention to one final moral crusade. Having owned slaves earlier in his life, Franklin had gradually come to see slavery as a moral abomination. In his final years, he became president of the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery. In February 1790, just weeks before his death, he signed a petition to Congress calling for the abolition of slavery. It was one of his last public acts, a reminder that even in his 80s, Franklin was still fighting for human freedom and dignity. By early 1790, it was clear that Franklin's body was failing. The kidney stones caused constant agony. He could barely walk. He spent most of his time in bed, reading, receiving visitors, and managing his pain with increasing doses of laudanum. On April 17, 1790, Benjamin Franklin died in his bed at home, surrounded by family. He was 84 years old. The cause was likely complications from the kidney stones and general organ failure. News of his death spread quickly through Philadelphia and then across the nation and to Europe. The tributes were extraordinary. The French National Assembly declared 3 days of mourning, the first time that body had honored a foreigner. The American Congress wore mourning badges for a month. His funeral, held on April 21st, was the largest Philadelphia had ever seen. 20,000 people, half the city's population, attended. They followed the casket to Christ Church Burial Ground, where Franklin was laid to rest beside Deborah. His grave marker is simple, as he requested in his will: Benjamin and Deborah Franklin. No titles, no honors, just their names. Visitors still leave pennies on the grave, honoring Poor Richard's wisdom about thrift. But Franklin had also written his own epitaph decades earlier, a playful meditation on his life and beliefs. The body of B. Franklin, printer, like the cover of an old book, its contents torn out and stripped of its lettering and gilding, lies here, food for worms. But the work shall not be wholly lost, for it will, as he believed, appear once more in a new and more perfect edition, corrected and amended by the author. It captured his wit, his optimism, his view of himself as fundamentally a printer, and his hope for something beyond death. Whether he truly believed in the new edition, or was simply making an elegant metaphor, we cannot know, but the epitaph was never carved on his tomb. He had asked for simplicity, and simplicity is what he received. The legacy Benjamin Franklin left behind was vast and multifaceted, touching nearly every aspect of American life and extending across the Atlantic to influence European thought as well. As a scientist, his discoveries about electricity transformed human understanding of natural forces. The lightning rod alone saved countless buildings and lives. His fundamental insights about positive and negative charge, about electrical conduction and insulation, laid groundwork for everything from telegraphy to modern power distribution. As an inventor, his practical genius produced devices that made life better. The Franklin stove, bifocals, the flexible catheter, the glass harmonica. Unlike most inventors, he refused to patent his creations, believing that knowledge should be freely shared for the public good. As a writer, his autobiography became required reading for ambitious Americans, teaching self-improvement through discipline and industry. Poor Richard's almanac shaped American values and speech, embedding his wisdom in the language itself. As a civic organizer, he pioneered the concept of voluntary associations working for public benefit. The library, fire company, hospital, and university he helped found in Philadelphia became models copied across America. The idea that citizens could band together to solve community problems without waiting for government or aristocratic patronage was revolutionary. As a diplomat, he secured the French alliance that made American independence possible. His Treaty of Paris established generous boundaries for the new nation. His work in France demonstrated that Americans could hold their own among European sophisticates. As a founding father, he helped draft the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, contributing crucial wisdom at key moments. His presence lent legitimacy and credibility to American independence. But perhaps his most enduring legacy is as the embodiment of a new kind of human being, the self-made American. Born into poverty with no advantages beyond intelligence and determination, Franklin rose to international fame through his own efforts. He proved that in the New World, talent mattered more than birth, that practical wisdom could rival classical education, that a tradesman could become a gentleman through virtue rather than inheritance. The values he championed, industry, frugality, self-improvement, civic responsibility, practical innovation, intellectual curiosity, became core elements of American identity. The American dream owes much to Franklin's example. He was not perfect. He could be vain, calculating, and manipulative. He neglected his wife, probably fathered an illegitimate child, and owned slaves for part of his life. His relationship with his son William, who remained loyal to Britain during the Revolution, ended in permanent estrangement. But his achievements so vastly outweighed his flaws that even his critics acknowledged his greatness. John Adams, who often disagreed with Franklin and resented his popularity, nevertheless called him a great and good man. Today, Franklin's presence remains inescapable in American life. His face appears on the $100 bill. His name graces streets, schools, and institutions across the nation. The organizations he founded, the Library Company, the American Philosophical Society, the University of Pennsylvania, continue their work. His inventions remain in use. His words are quoted daily, often by people who don't realize they're quoting him. Walk into any public library in America, and you're experiencing Franklin's legacy. The concept of free public libraries supported by citizens for mutual benefit was his innovation. Every fire department staffed by volunteers traces back to his Union Fire Company. Every civic organization working to improve communities follows the model he established with the junto. Scientists studying electricity stand on foundations he laid. Diplomats practicing practical statecraft can look to his example. Writers seeking clear, vigorous prose can study his style. Anyone attempting self-improvement can learn from his methodical approach. Benjamin Franklin never climbed a mountain, but he drew lightning from the sky. He never commanded armies, but he helped win a war. He never held supreme power, but he helped create a nation. The runaway apprentice became one of the most influential human beings in history, and he did it all through curiosity, discipline, and the conviction that ordinary people working together could accomplish extraordinary things. Consider the journey we've traced tonight, from a tallow chandler's shop in Boston to the salons of Paris, from a teenage runaway with bread under his arms to the friend of kings and philosophers, from Poor Richard to the sage of the American Revolution. It was a life that spanned nearly the entire 18th century, that witnessed and helped create the transformation from colonial dependence to national independence. Benjamin Franklin proved that genius could emerge from anywhere, that education could be self-directed, that practical wisdom could rival academic learning, that a tradesman could become a statesman, and that one person's curiosity and effort could genuinely change the world. He was the first American celebrity, the first American scientist of international renown, and in many ways the first recognizably modern American. The values he embodied, pragmatism, innovation, self-reliance, civic duty, and the belief that tomorrow can be better than today, remains central to American identity. 234 years after his death, Benjamin Franklin's light still illuminates. His life reminds us that circumstances of birth need not determine destiny, that knowledge pursued with discipline opens doors, that service to community enriches individual lives, and that one person committed to making things better actually can. The boy who loved to read by candlelight brought electricity to the world. The apprentice who ran away with nothing built institutions that endure. The tradesman who never attended university became a doctor of philosophy in the eyes of the world's finest institutions.